All right, we are now three buckets under our belt. We've got evolution of behavior, we've got molecular genetics and behavior, we got behavior genetics. Today we are switching to another bucket, a completely different one, and as we explore it, you will see what's going to count as an explanation for an evolutionary person, as an explanation for any of these buckets. What that will then consist of is they're done there, and this is where our new bucket begins. And a great example of it is looking at the difference between people who study the evolution of behavior and ethologists. Evolution of behavior go through all these optimization, econometric equations as to when you should do what in Prisoner's Dilemma and how stickleback fish have been selected for this or that. And what the ethologists then say is, have you ever actually looked at an animal? Do you ever actually go out and see what they're doing? And this is the starting point for ethology. Okay, ethology in a historical context, turn of the last century. Oh, psychology was dominated by naval contemplation. William James, who was sort of half psychologist, half philosopher, and the two strands were intertwined, all of that. But early on in the 20th century, modernity, it is time to get rid of that nonsensical, philosophical, subjective philosophy, psychology stuff. And what was ushered in was what became the dominant model of psychology for the 20th century in the United States, behaviorism. Behaviorism, and its starting point was that guy John Watson, who I read the quote from him in the very first class. Give me any kid and I'll turn him into a doctor or a lawyer or a bigger soup ladle or something. And this was John Watson who started the field. And his notion was one of radical environmentalism. If I could control what's going on in the world outside this individual, I can shape them. I could reward them and punish them in such a way that I could turn them into anything I want. So Watson, as we heard, soon decayed into being an advertising executive after his academic scandal, but the mantle of it was taken up by arguably the most famous psychologist of the 20th century, certainly American one, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner inherited the field and became the most dominating intellect in behaviorism, B.F. Skinner. What was behaviorism about in its full-blown form, once Skinner was off and running with it? Three organizing principles. First one, that whole business about environmentalism. If you can control the environment, you can control what's going to come out of the animal. You have all sorts of control in there. There's very little that is unchangeable. Give me a child of any sort, and if I can control their environment, I could turn them into anything. Next sort of principle of theirs, of their three guiding lights, was reinforcement theory. How do you turn anything into anything? By rewarding some of their behaviors, by punishing others, positive reinforcement, or by taking away something that they like, by taking away something that's aversive, so that counts as a good thing. That if you can, and the word that Skinner emphasized endlessly, you can shape the behavior of an organism by controlling the positive, negative things that happen in its life contingent on its behavior. So, radical environmentalism, an emphasis on the way you shape behavior, is with different flavors of reward and punishment. Their third principle, which could be encompassed in sort of not saying, if you can control the rewards and punishments, you could shape the behavior of an animal. You could shape the behavior of any animal, including humans. These were universal laws. These were absolute, and as such, like species were interchangeable. A rat is a monkey, is a child. Skinner used to say things like that. That radical control of the rewards and punishments, radical emphasis that this could accomplish anything, this environmental thing, and this assumption that these laws apply to every single living social organism out there. Universal laws. So, with that under their belts, behaviorists took over American psychology, and when you read about these people and what they were like, these soulless droids who reduced all behavior down to a few reinforcement equations. They're like, okay, Watson, here's how soulless of a droid Watson was. And one of his writings somewhere in there, he has a paragraph talking about something about reinforcement theory in babies, and he refers to a baby as it like 10 times in that paragraph. That's what these people were like. Skinner took this to an extreme. Skinner had this very disconcerting shiny forehead. And he wound up doing most of his work with pigeons because for some reason pigeons for him were better than lab rats and pigeons. And every picture of him would always have him like looming with his shiny forehead over some pigeon or whatever. And it's a terrifying picture. When I was a child, my parents had a model of B.F. Skinner, which anytime I was disobedient, they would pull out there, and it was okay. These were these behaviorists. Babies are its. You just loom over your lab animals. They're all interchangeable. This cold, heartless world. We're saying things like, you don't study emotions. All you study is what goes in and what comes out the other side, because who cares about emotions? Things. Okay, so this was behaviorism. And there were plenty of decades in the latter part of the last century where essentially every academic psychology department out there was overflowing with behaviorists, and it was the dominant school. And all throughout, as behaviorism took over American psychology, all throughout, quietly, out in the boondocks in Europe, a completely different scientific approach to behavior was being invented. This notion, this field of ethology. Ethology, what are its principles? Animals will often do things that make no sense in the context of reward and punishment. You got to figure out there's more things going on there than that. Next, environmentalism. All environments could do the same thing. Ridiculous. The way you study an animal is studying it in its natural environment. Universality, crazy. The thing that's interesting is the unique ways that every species has solved a behavioral challenge. What the ethologists were like, and it was this trio who started it, what they were like, Darwin era parsons who go out into the field and collect butterflies, and instead of like the parsons back then glorying in God's variety and making all these different types of butterflies, they would just go and glory in the variability that evolution had given rise to in behavior, different behavioral solutions that you could only appreciate in the natural environment. They came up with all sorts of great witty quotes, things like, the study of animal behavior is the process of interviewing an animal in its own language. Or studying the behavior of rats in a cage is like studying the behavior of dolphins in a bathtub. You got to go out into the field. So you had this very, very different sort of field emerging, and it was these three guys who started it. Nico Tinbergen, Dutch scientist who was amazing and like this huge moral, intellectual giant who I hugely admired. This guy, Karl von Frisch, who, as far as I can tell, never spoke. And as far as I can also tell, going back through the pictures, by the time he was a teenager, he already looked like a very dignified old man. And Konrad Lorenz, who we heard from in the first class, Konrad Lorenz and his Nazi propagandist views at the time about how we could save us from racial degeneracy in our gene stocks and things like that. Konrad Lorenz, rabid Nazi, unapologetic Nazi for the rest of his life, a Nazi propagandist. And what he spent a lot of World War II doing was he was in charge of a division of behavioral scientists who would interview prisoners of war who were half Polish, half German. and decide which which ones were German enough not to be executed. And again, he went to his grave saying, "Oh, all I did, I spent World War II with my little duckies. I'm a very apolitical man." Okay, so the three of them, Tinbergen, who was an amazing experimentalist, von Frisch, who was actually also an amazing experimentalist, and Lorenz, and the three of them started this whole field, and its principles were totally the opposite. Again, of behaviorism. Uniform rules of reward and punishment don't work because they work differently in different species. This in and of itself undoes this whole universality. How is this species behaviorally solving its particular environmental or social challenge? Environmental is a notion you can just interchangeable study them in a cage. You got to go out in the field and study animals in their natural habitats. So, except for Lorenz, the ethologists were wonderful, and they all wore like hiking boots and had like these knobby knees, and were out in the field and getting all sorts of great insect bites and things like that. And you can tell I'm rooting for the ethologists over the behaviorists. So ethology emerged as this field. Nobody in US psychology was paying attention to it. They were out in the boondocks there in Europe looking at little birdies in the woods there and stuff. And out of it came a whole separate science for thinking about behavior of its own. And one of the all-time unexpected cool moves ever, at one point, the three of them were given the Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine, and like the lab scientific community throughout the world was flabbergasted at this. This is wait, they've never cloned something? They're not clones. This is like them giving out Nobel Prizes to people with like foot fungi from being out in the field for too long. It was viewed as one of the most bizarre decisions, and I think it was a great one. Okay, so the three of them wound up as Nobel laureates for being the founding trio of ethology. So what was ethology about? What was it about? It was basically organized around these questions, and Tinbergen was the one who sort of formalized all of this. What's the behavior that you're looking at? And this is ethology out the wazoo, because implicit in that is, and if you're not looking at the animal in its natural environment, you're going to have no idea what the behavior is about. It's going to be distorted. It's going to be abnormal. So what's the actual behavior? And the theme there is behaviors are occurring in all sorts of subtle, unexpected ways. So what's the behavior? The next question was straight out of the evolutionary biology lectures, which is, well, what's the behavior good for? What's the adaptive value for it? Oh, adaptive value, that's from a few weeks ago, like evolution of adaptive behavior, all of that. And the difference was where an evolutionary biologist would come up with some models for optimizing adaptive behavior, something shit, the ethologists went out into the field and did experiments. They did experiments to show what this behavior or that behavior were actually good for. Next, what they would ask is, okay, this animal just did this behavior, and we know what it's good for. This animal just did this. What triggered it to happen? What stimulated it? What caused that behavior to be released? And then, in the early decades of ethology, what was like an impossible question, what's going on in the brain mediating this sort of stuff? And they came up with terminology for that. What is the behavior? Roughly came to be called a fixed action pattern, an FAP. What does the behavior look like? Behavior coming in units of fixed action patterns. What is it good for? What's the adaptive value? Jargon that emerged with this. What's the releasing stimulus? What in that animal's sensory world just triggered it to do this particular fixed action pattern? And finally, what they called the innate releasing mechanism, as in what's going on where the releasing stimulus happens here and the fixed action pattern behavior pops out the other side. What went on in between? And what we would call that is neuroscience and endocrinology and genetics, but innate releasing mechanisms. And the early decades of ethology, they knew they couldn't figure out anything about this. Okay, so let's have an objective analysis of what the behavior looks like. Let's do experiments, figure out what it's good for, what in the sensory environment triggered that fixed action pattern, and what's the innate releasing mechanism, what's going on in the brain there. So with that, they began to study behaviorist naturalistic settings. So fixed action patterns, FAPs, people at first confused this with a totally distorted, misinterpreted, obsolete concept from sort of American psychology of instincts and reflexes. And those are as far as you can get from scientific terms when it comes to behavior. What was a fixed action pattern about? According to these ethologists, it's a unit of behavior. It's a unit of behavior that has a meaning. It's multi-muscle. It's not just, you raise one eyebrow and you've just done a fixed action pattern. It involves coordination of a number of muscle systems to produce a complicated unit of behavior that has a social meaning. So that was the first requirement of it, that it looked like that, which is a world away from a knee reflex when the doctor bops your knee, or instinct, whatever that means. And it means egregiously different things to some people when they come to sort of political views about biology, all of that. It's a unit of behavior, and it's complicated enough that it's involving multiple muscle systems, and it has meaning. The second requirement, the second thing that defined a fixed action pattern, is an animal didn't have to learn how to do it. Animals would know automatically how to do a fixed action pattern. Oh, there's no learning involved. There's learning involved in an intensely interesting way, which is animals don't need experience to learn how to perform a fixed action pattern. What learning is about is them learning to do it better, to do it more effectively, to do it in the right social context. And this is a critical feature of this. Okay, what would be an example of a fixed action pattern? Squirrels. You take baby squirrels who are raised in isolation from other squirrels, or just fed lab squirrel kibble or whatever, and you give a baby squirrel a nut, and it will know how to crack the nut open. A classic fixed action pattern, like you're doing lots of stuff with your muscles there, and nobody had to teach that kid how to crack open a nut. Where does learning come in? What you see is, over time, baby squirrels get more efficient at cracking nuts. It takes them less time, or they get a larger percentage of the food inside them. So fixed action patterns. And you see that other versions of this. There's one that's called the visual cliff phenomenon, which people in the 50s, somehow this wound up in every psychology textbook. You have a room where you've got a flat surface, which then drops about 3 feet and then continues down there. You have this cliff. And what you've done is, at the end of this cliff, you've put a sheet of glass, such that an organism can go walking along the cliff and just continue walking over the sheet of glass. Except that's not what organisms did. For some reason, every single picture we see in these experiments, it's always the same checkered red and white linoleum that they used for this. You have what happened is, you take, like, I don't know, a baby hippo, and it's walking across the cliff, and then you push it out onto the glass, and it freaks out. It's looking down and seeing the ground way below. It freaks out because this visual cliff phenomenon, having adverse responses to it, is a fixed action pattern. They do not have to have learned by trial and error that each time I step off this, if I fall down this much, that is not pleasing. I'll leave fewer copies of my genes. Animals, organisms know automatically that visual cliffs are scary and respond to them, including human babies. And there's all these classic pictures where somebody has volunteered their infant to be pushed out onto the glass, and they're all freaking out at that, and that's very distressing. And Now you see ethology in action. Among a number of species, you don't see the visual cliff phenomenon with a sloth. You take a baby sloth and you push him out off of the solid surface onto the glass and it's looming below, and baby sloths don't freak out. How come? Because if you're a baby sloth, if you're a sloth, you spend an awful lot of your time looking at a big open space down below. Tree-dwelling species didn't have visual cliff responses. So, not universal, and showing the role of learning. Children will habituate and figure out that this actually is okay, and not to. So, another fixed action pattern. More versions of it. Fixed action pattern. You raise a monkey in social isolation, and we will eventually get to some very troubling, controversial studies done in that realm, but a monkey that has never encountered another monkey. And finally, you introduce the two of them, and your study subject is a young monkey, and the other one is this big, threatening adult. And what does this young monkey do? It crouches down in a subordinate gesture. It performs a fixed action pattern, which signals subordination to the other one, or you could have the other one doing what is called a threat yawn. They display their canines just to really disturb you if you sort of freeze that frame. You display your canines, and that's threatening. And this infant, this baby monkey, has never been threatened by another monkey before, but it freaks out at it. Dominance displays are fixed action patterns. Nobody has to teach that monkey who to grovel to. What involves learning there is the monkey not learning how to grovel better or faster or with more aerobic exercise going into it. What it needs to learn is who. Who do you subordinate yourself to? What's the appropriate social context for your subordination? So you see some things just pop out already in place without learning in young organisms immediately after birth, but you gotta learn context. It's like in Charlotte's Web, when all of her babies instantly could say salutations to Fern, but they needed to learn they probably should not have said that to Fern's father. Fixed action pattern with social contextual learning. Another example of it, showing that monkeys understand the principles of fixed action patterns. Vervet monkeys. Vervet monkeys, there's two things that are terrifying to you if you're a vervet monkey. One is raptors, birds that will come down and carry you off and kill you and eat you, or snakes. Things in the air that are scary, or things on the ground that are scary. And an enormously interesting finding when we get around to the language lectures is vervets basically have two words in their alarm vocabulary. They have a different vocalization for scary thing up there, run down the tree, and a different one for scary thing on the ground, run up the tree. Two different vocalizations, meaning semanticity, a term we'll eventually get to. So where does the fixed action pattern thing come in? Young kids, incredibly young vervet monkeys, know how to do the eagle alarm call or the snake alarm call. It's a fixed action pattern. Nobody has to teach them, okay, hold this sound a little bit longer, wait, higher pitch on that. They don't have to be taught. They have to be taught the appropriate social context. What do I mean by this? Young vervets, when giving their alarm calls, mess up a lot. They give the wrong one some of the time. They are not very good at it yet, at knowing that this vocalization is for those things, and they make mistakes. They make mistakes, and this could be disastrous if you're telling the entire group to run down the tree straight into the snake's mouth, kind of thing. And what shows that vervets understand the features of fixed action patterns? Adults don't pay attention to their alarm calls until they're seconded by some adult. Because all of them are sitting there saying, oh, sure, this kid knows how to make the right sounds, but this dumbass kid is probably mistaking eagles for snakes or whatever. Has anybody else seen what this kid is seeing? Okay, is it an eagle or is it a snake? Adults don't respond to young vervet's fixed action pattern alarm calls because they know that kids don't really know what they're doing. Okay, so human fixed action patterns, the visual cliff phenomenon, but all sorts of other stuff. Smiling. Smiling involves an amazing number of muscles in your face, and all kids start smiling at roughly the same age and coordinating their muscles in the same way. And you can say, oh, of course, obviously, because they're looking at people smiling, and you take infants who are blind and they start smiling right on schedule when sighted infants would start smiling. It's a fixed action pattern. Where does the learning come in? And any of you who will eventually have like an infant on your hands will discover at one point they do one of the most charmingly socially incorrect things you can ever possibly imagine, which is they'll smile at a mannequin. They'll smile expecting a big warm smile, and they got to learn, okay, mannequins, you don't activate the smiling fixed action pattern. For some reason, they don't do it back at you. Perfect pitch. Perfect pitch. Musicians who have perfect pitch, you love them, having them in your chorus because they can always tell you what the first note is in perfect pitch. Perfect pitch is a genetically programmed trait. There's a gene or genes for it. I don't know what the current status is of finding, but you either have it or you don't. If you don't have it, you are never going to have perfect pitch. If you do have the genetic makeup, you're going to have perfect pitch if and only if you were trained in music when you were young. Okay, and this is your scale of perfect pitchness. And what we see here is exposure to music early in life. If you had no exposure, doesn't matter which version of the gene you have, if and only if you've had lots of exposure, musical training, the perfect pitch gene, people will suddenly burst out with perfect pitch. What does this look like? This should look incredibly familiar. This should be bringing flashbacks from 48 hours ago. This is a gene-environment interaction, that sort of thing, except ethologists, developmental human ethology type people rarely frame it in that context. That's a behavior genetics, but that's exactly what it is. So you need experience with that. What else? You get kids at a remarkably early age, if they have a choice between looking at this and looking at this, they very strongly prefer intact faces. And faces that are doing the right thing, if you show them a Picasso face with the two eyes on this side, they start crying. They get it because they immediately, kids do not have to be taught that this is a very rare human whose ears are floating around and that kind of thing. Instead, they have a strong preference for intact faces. Faces with two eyes instead of one. Faces with two ears instead of, and nobody's teaching kids that. It's, if you ever see one of the all-time great movies, Toy Story 3, there's the point where Mr. Potato Head, he gets turned into a tortilla. I can't remember how he winds it, and his individual features fall off, and that is incredibly distressing to kids when they watch that, but fortunately it gets put together again. Those of you who will ever be sitting around watching where children grow up on you, the last 5 minutes of that movie will leave you a blubbering mess every single time you watch it. Fixed action patterns. Kids know this ain't right. They'd rather look at this. They have a preference for that. So all sorts of these fixed action patterns. Other ones with humans. Human fixed action pattern is you only had a nurse. Nobody teaches the 5-minute-old kid how to nurse properly. Fixed action pattern. What goes into the learning there? Kids get more efficient at nursing, getting more milk per unit time. They get better at it. Perfect example of this. Other realms, facial expressions, every culture on Earth, if you kind of want to say hello to somebody, but you really don't want to get into a conversation with them, and you want to walk past quickly, but you got to acknowledge somebody, you quickly go, you raise your eyebrows very briefly. Every culture on Earth does this. You take people from any culture on Earth, and they can tell the difference between the face of someone who is grieving, someone who is angry, someone who is euphoric. Facial expressions are fixed action patterns. Where does the learning come in? For example, if you were going to become a good poker player, you learn to control your facial expression fixed action patterns. Don't give this one under this circumstance fixed action patterns again. Okay, so a sense of that first one. What does the behavior look like? Where does the learning come in? How much learning is needed? Well, okay, so fixed action patterns. The next thing they would ask is, what is the behavior good for? Evolutionary biology version of saying that, what's the adaptive value of maximizing the number of copies and genes in the next generation? What's the behavior good for? And this is where incredibly elegant, clever field experiments out there. For example, Tinbergen mostly studied gulls along the Netherlands coastline there, and he noticed a weird thing, which is your mommy gull and your chicks have just popped out of their eggs there, and the shell fragments are scattered all over the place. And he noticed they would go through a fixed action pattern. The mother would now go over, and any eggshell that had the inside white part showing, she would turn over, just like that. And you could put like a piece of white paper, and you would trigger this turning it over, turning it over. What was the purpose of that? The outside of the egg was speckled. The inside was bright white. So Tinbergen decides to do an experiment. So he crawls out there in the bushes there, and some mother gull has just turned over all the eggshells so that the mottled side is pointing upward, and he flips over a whole bunch of them. And what happens then, horrifyingly, that means that raptors, predators up in the sky, it's easier for them to pick up the white glint of the eggshell rather than the speckled darker part on the outside. And whoa, hooray for collecting data, more of the chicks get eaten. That's what it's good for. Why do mother gulls do that? Because more of their kids survive. Another example of getting at this, and this was where von Frisch made his famed bee dances. When bees come back from being scouts looking for a food source, they come back and they do a very stereotypical bee dance on the floor of a hive there, and everybody's kind of touching them to see what it is they're doing, and this hugely ritualistic thing. And what von Frisch figured out is, what is the bee dance carrying as communication? What's the information in it? And again, doing these wonderfully clever experiments. This time he has like a piano stool that he puts out in the middle of the field, and he's got a beehive on it, and he has let some bee go out in that direction to find some great food, and the bee comes back to the hive and starts bee dancing. And here's where von Frisch crawls out with the glasses, and from underneath he rotates the hive 90 degrees, and what he sees is the bees fly off in the wrong direction. Oh, once the scout comes back, it is giving information about what direction you fly to find the food. And what he further decoded eventually was encoded also in the bee dance was how far you should fly, how good of a food source it is, and endlessly sort of clever experiments showing this is what it does. You come back and dance, and if you dance right, they all go out and they find the food, unless some ethologist is rotate into your hive on you. So that was great. That whole phenomenon, by the way, gave rise to the best title of a paper I have ever seen. This was in the journal Nature, and it was talking about some beehive colonies are somehow more effective at bee dancing, and they have more likelihood of the hive surviving. And the title of the paper was Honeybees Accrue Fitness Through Dancing, which is a wonderful time. Okay, more getting at the purpose of these things. There's a fixed action pattern in crocodiles and alligators, which is they will often duck underneath the water and come back onto the surface so that they have a branch, a twig, across their snout. What's up with this? I don't know which ethologists were doing this study to go in and intervene, but what it shows is if you take the twig off, You don't get birds that are trying to get twigs to make their nest. You get fewer birds that happen to land on the crocodile's snout and then get eaten. Oh, what's the adaptive value of getting twigs on your snout there? It makes it easier for you to catch birds and eat them. So all these sorts of examples of field studies showing like what's this stuff good for. Ooh, I can tell you how it's good to do this strategy in Prisoner's Dilemma and do forgiving tit for tat on even days of the month. And because look at this model when you run these computer simulations. Go out and you rotate the beehive 90 degrees and all of them fly in the wrong direction. Ah, the bee dance contains information that they can decode. Next one, what is releasing this adaptive behavior? What is the releasing stimulus that triggers this behavior? And ethologists sort of developed a whole bunch of techniques for how you figure this out. And here would be a great example. This was Tinbergen's work, which is he looks at baby gulls peck at mom's beak and she regurgitates food for them or whatever. And this is in some way something about the pecking triggers her fixed action pattern of feeding them. How do baby gulls know how to do this? Because he did all sorts of experiments showing that it was innate in there. What are they focusing on? What is it that makes baby birds peck at their mother's bill, beak, whatever? And what he noted was like all of these birds have red dots on their beaks. And he said, oh, maybe that's the releasing stimulus that triggers the pecking fixed action pattern. So at that point, you would come up with computer models if you're an evolutionary biologist. What do you do if you're Tinbergen? You do an experiment. You take some mother gulls and you paint over the red spot. And you see the gull pups, whatever the little ones are called, they don't peck there anymore. You've done a subtraction experiment. You then do a replacement, a substitution experiment. You've painted over the red spot, and then you get your marker and you do a red, and they start pecking again. And what they then developed, Tinbergen, was what he called superstimulation. This time, paint the entire beak of that gull bright red, and these kids will just peck at it till the cows come home 24/7. Ooh, this red dot is a releasing stimulus. When it's not present, you don't release the fixed action pattern, and it's responsive. If you have a super stimulating version of that releasing stimulus, you could get extremely intense behavioral output. So that would be the general approach. What sensory thing in the environment is triggering that behavior? And it's here that sort of the ethological principle of you got to interview a language in its own, you got to interview an animal in its own language comes to the forefront the most, because what you need to incorporate to start studying this thing is there's sensory stuff going on in a world of different species that we haven't a clue about. Species singing electricity that we'll hear about, communicating through vibration. There's this wonderful book by the writer Ed Young. It's called An Immense Universe, where each chapter he explores the bizarrities out there in the living world of different sensory systems. And the point isn't, ooh, aren't these cool and bizarre? Ooh, aren't we better at it than they are? But it's just a term that he invokes, a German word that sort of preceded ethology, but was taken to heart by them, this word Umwelt, which I'm certain I've just mispronounced. Umwelt in animals, Umwelt is the sensory world around it that is relevant to its experience. And there's incredibly bizarre stuff going on there. You've got species where they're hearing different stimuli at different speeds because of how you've got fish where they swim along the surface and the top of their eyes look up and can process stuff in black and white. Right in the middle, looking over the surface, does UV light or polarized light, and below it does color vision. The eye. Whoa, who would guess that? Just incredibly wild stuff going on here. Go home and read about mantis shrimp and about their visual systems. There's animals seeing in the visual spectrum we can only dream of, that hear stuff that's too low, that's too high for us to hear, olfactory, all of that. So the big challenge was you're interviewing the animal in its language, not yours. You've got to be incredibly open-minded to the possibility that communicative stuff is going on there that nobody would readily recognize as a human with our sensory parameters. So using that approach, what would count as releasing stimuli in the auditory realm? And you find these studies, things like in deer and red deer and moose deer and something, these quadruped things that run around in Minnesota and stuff. What you find is there's a fixed action pattern that males giving roaring sound that stags give, which is roaring enough that you could apparently hear it miles away. And if you're a female and you hear it, you get an interesting physiological response, which is you ovulate. You're a reflex ovulator, and you become sexually receptive to this hollering guy if he ever shows up. The fixed action patterns of male bellowing work as releasing stimuli for female reproductive behavior and reproductive physiology. So that would be one example. Here's another one of those where, again, ethology principles like crazy. Pick up a lab rat. Okay, actually devote your entire career to tickling rats. Tickling rats, you just tickle it just like you would tickle anybody else and tickle it, and they do whatever it is you tickle. And then you look at their auditory range that comes with ultrasonic vocalization stuff that we can't hear, but you get the right instruments that can shoot, and you tickle them and they giggle. I kid you not, that is the word in the scientific literature. They giggle, you tickle them, and rats and mice giggle. Giggle. What the hell is that about? What does that mean? They like it? They like it. Like when we get tickled or whatever. Yes, they do. When you tickle a rat, it releases dopamine in the reward parts of its brain. Rats will learn to work to press a lever in order to get tickled. So that's going on in ultrasonic sound range that we haven't a clue about. That's happening there. More examples. Here's one of those where you have to wonder how somebody stumbles into a research project like this. Panda bears, female panda bears, when they're ovulating, the pitch of their voice raises a little bit. It's a little bit higher. Nuts and bulbs, estrogen is doing something to the larynx. So when pandas are ovulating, their voices get a little bit higher. When humans are ovulating, their voices get a little bit higher. And best of all, if you've got male pandas or male heterosexual humans and they get choices, there's a preference for voices that are a little bit higher. Whoa, this is going on. Like the range of one's voice is signaling all sorts of things. So lots of auditory stuff. Obviously, visual cues, and we're like the most visual species out there, so that was very easy for people in the ethology business to imagine that was going to be relevant. And here would be a classic ethology study showing what about a particular visual stimulus is essential for triggering a fixed action pattern. I looked at a film of this once, and it was the most like humiliating thing I could ever imagine on earth, this film. What they had in the film was an artificial female turkey. They had a big styrofoam ball and some thing headish that they'd step on at the front and some feathers in the back, and they released this male turkey into there, and being not a very intelligent species, and what he immediately does is he tries to mate with this thing because this is giving all the releasing stimuli to get the fixed action patterns of mating. And you get to watch that he's like climbing all over the styrofoam ball. Then you do your subtraction and substitution and ethology type experiments. You now take the head that was stuck in the styrofoam there and you pull it out with the teeth, and you put it in here. And now you let the male come in. And he kind of pauses for a while and doesn't put quite as much effort into mating. And now you try this version. The head's facing the wrong way, the feathers are on top, and the male turkey takes even more time to, and then you'll like scatter the pieces all over the room, and the male turkey just gets traumatized and says, what is it about female turkeyness that evokes reproductive fixed action patterns in males? And it wound up being something about the axis of the tails and the head, and this is the sort of studies that will be done. Of course, releasing stimuli that are olfactory. And by the time we get to the sex lectures, to the aggression lectures, we're going to be exploring a ton about pheromones, olfactory information. We will get to that just as a first pass at it, showing human olfaction as a releasing stimulus. You let people smell somebody else's sweat. Okay, once again, who comes up with these experiments and who gets the volunteers? You could smell one of two different, the subject is given one of two different kinds of sweat to smell. The first one is sweat from somebody who's totally terrified. And the volunteers they had for this part of it did their first jump out of an airplane, and as soon as they got on the ground and couldn't believe they were still alive, the scientists descend on them and swab their armpits with Q-tips and stuff and put in a little vial. So now you have a vial of scared human sweat. And in contrast, you get volunteers who've just been having a great time playing soccer or something, and you like lick their armpits and get it into the jar there. So you've got scared sweat and happy sweat. And humans smell those, and they can't tell the difference. They smell absolutely the same. But when you smell the scared sweat, the amygdala activates. The amygdala relevant to fear and anxiety. And what that does is lower the threshold for triggering fear behaviors in an individual. Smell that sort of sweat, and your brain has just made yourself have a lower threshold for this. That's a releasing stimulus in humans? Yeah, that's got something to do with it. Another version of it, you get a little vial of tears from people, and either like you tell them their panda has died and they're crying and you collect the tears, or you like spritz lemon juice or something in their eyes and you get tears that are for a protective purpose, cleaning out the eyes. So you collect the emotional tears and the unemotional ones, and once again, people cannot consciously tell the difference, but smelling the emotional ones changes people's assessments of the attractiveness of other people without knowing that's happening. What else? Electricity, electric fish. Electric fish not only use electricity to defend themselves from predators and to stun prey and eat, but they use it communicatively. They do mating songs with electricity. They have mating fixed action patterns. They have males straight out of our evolutionary biology lectures and sperm competing with each other. Electric fish males will try to jam each other's frequencies. And each fish has a distinctive electrical song and frequency, and they try to mess the other one up competitively, and this is going on with electricity. Spiders are communicating by the vibratory patterns they do on the webs, where they can discern like 20 vibrations a second versus 21 and a half, and 20, they're talking about scary, terrifying things, and 21 and a half, they're talking about existentialism or something they can distinguish. So that's going on communicatively. All that stuff. Tactile. This gave rise to one of the all-time important studies in psychology, and one that had a strong ethological flavor, even though people didn't interpret it as such at the time, because nobody really knew what those like guys in the alpine shorts were doing over in Europe. But this was a study carried out by a primatologist named Harry Harlow. And we will get back to his studies and the ethical sort of weight that they raised in terms of were these unacceptably brutal studies. But in his classic version of it, he has baby rhesus monkeys. And they're being raised in the absence of a rhesus monkey mother. And instead, what they had in a room and a cage was two different types of surrogate mothers. Surrogate mothers was the term given for it. And one of the surrogate mothers gave milk. It was this chicken wire torso with this like styrofoam head on it and a milk bottle jammed out, so just coming out there. So this baby monkey, of holding on to the chicken wire mother, could nurse. The other mother didn't give milk, but she had a warm blanket wrapped around her torso. It was warmed up, warm physical contact. And who did the baby monkeys prefer? They would go to get milk from mom with a bottle there, chicken wire mom, but they would spend all their time on the other mother having the tactile stimulation from that. And that was a classic demonstration of something it's very hard to think back that this was the mindset in the 1950s. Developmental psychologists, pediatricians, things like that. What are mothers good for? They supply you with calories. And what he taught was, no, they don't do that. That's not what they're critical for, because according to behaviorists, B.F. Skinner would have spent all his time on the chicken wire mother nursing there because it was reinforcing in a very simplistic behaviors. Oh, physical contact is a source of comfort. And what was revolutionary about this, because at the time, general practices in pediatric wards was, sterility, germ theory, keep kids in the hospital basically sterilely isolated. Don't touch him. Don't touch him. All mothers are good for is supplying milk or something, and we're doing it for her. So allow the mother to visit the kid in the hospital, say, for 90 minutes every other Thursday or something, because mothers are that physical touch. And we will eventually get to the mechanisms by which appropriate physical contact in human babies stimulates growth by way of growth hormone release. Okay, so tactile stuff. Now, all of this came together, sort of conspiring with the greatest ethologist of all time, which was Walt Disney. And in your handout, you've got this thing, the evolution of Mickey Mouse. And this was Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard evolutionary biologist, was the first one who sort of noted this and did a formal analysis, how Mickey Mouse evolved over the course of time. And the way he started out in the very beginning, I don't know, 1920s, 1930s or something, he wasn't even called Mickey Mouse. He was called Steamboat Willie. And he wasn't a mouse, he was a rat. He was a rat, and he was like untrustworthy and vicious and sexually menacing and all of that. And slowly Disney figured out how to make Mickey Mouse look like Mickey Mouse. And suddenly, the rat's snout begins to shorten there and become rounder, and the forehead gets rounder, and the eyes get bigger, and the ears get bigger and cute, and somewhere along the way, Mickey loses one of his fingers, so now he only has 4 of them, and then pretty soon he's got those pants on, so there's no suggestion of like any sexuality in him. And what have you done to Mickey over the course of the decades? As follows, 2 things. You've made Mickey look more like a baby. You have neotenized this appearance. And the second thing is, as a result, it makes him look cute. And it elicits a cute response. You find it much nicer to look at Mickey's current form, where all he's doing with Minnie Mouse is they're like exchanging flowers or something and watching Barbie movies and stuff. But the original one was like this menacing, sexually suggestive, and now they're cute, and they're like newborn babies. Mickey is so cute, and you have a cute response. You show pictures of Mickey Mouse in 1930 and current Mickey Mouse to polar bears, and they look at Steamboat Willie, and nothing happens, and you show them the new one, they say, oh my God, that baby is so cute, I just want to take care of that baby. You elicit a cute response. Babies' features act as releasing stimuli for all sorts of positive, affective, protective responses, fixed action patterns, and all sorts of species out there, like baby crocodiles even look like slightly cute. And Walt Disney would instruct his eventual teams of artists how to make babies look cute. I was about to talk about how cute it looks, but actually looked at from a distance, it's hideously disturbing. But you can see the exact same thing, the evolution of the panda bear logo for the World Wildlife Fund, and over time it got more neotenized. And what people have actually done research on is changing the size of the eyes, and the bigger those eyes are, the more adorable they look and all of that, the more money people are willing to give to this conservation group. Manipulated the releasing factor here, just how adorably big the eyes look, and the fixed action pattern signing a check over to those people or whatever. You can see that animals have evolved in some cases for being able to exploit fixed action patterns, and the greatest example of this on Earth is dogs. They all have their eyebrows raised and they're looking up and they're so adorable. My wife and I, we spent like half the night last night and I said, honey, which dog is cuter? This one, okay, how about this? We practically did an all-nighter getting the pictures to put into your handout. Dogs look incredibly cute when they do that. What's that about? They look like babies. They look like baby wolves. Baby wolves can raise their eyebrows, and that works as a releasing stimulus for maternal behavior. And what do you see in dogs? Dogs have evolved a novel type of muscle here that allows them as adults to raise their eyebrows because we bred them. We bred them to have cute facial expressions, and they bred us to respond to their cute facial expressions. So we've officially entered the black box of ethology, which is a releasing stimulus happens and the creature sees it or smells it or feels the vibration or whatever it is, and out pops a behavior out the other side. Out comes a fixed action pattern. And for the first 50, 60 years of ethology, what everyone would say is something happens in between. There was this black box, this innate releasing mechanism, the brain, hormones, genes, all of that. And what then started to emerge, I don't know, 1980s or so, was the ability to start to understand what is going on in the brain. What is the mediation that happens that connects a releasing stimulus with a fixed action pattern? And what emerged was the subfield of neuroethology. And that became the trendiest field out there, subfield of ethology. And what's in this black box thing? Classic lab studies doing neuroethology. One of the greatest ones is looking at bird song. An ethologist at Berkeley named Mark Konishi decades ago found different vocalizations, calls that they gave, mating calls, bird song stuff, and dialects in different parts of the Bay Area. And what he said about trying to study, and 2-3 generations worth of his lab descendants now, is trying to figure out the circuitry of how do birds learn their species bird song, their regional bird song, their parent bird song, things of that sort. And there's amazing knowledge about this by now as to exactly every step going on there and where the learning happens and what happens in species where they forget their bird song over winter and they learn a new one the next spring. And this neuroethology pulled up this revolutionary finding, which is that involves them making new neurons. Birds learn their new annual songs by making new neurons, enormously detailed understanding of that by now. Another realm, you take a female hamster and you push her around and nothing happens. But if it so happens that she's ovulating, if you push on her flanks, you will elicit a reflex. She will arch her back, something called the lordosis reflex. And what that does by arching her back, it's exposing her genitals, facilitating mating. We just finished with this bucket into one of our old ones, facilitating her passing on copies of her genes, facilitating mating. And it's an incredibly interesting reflex because it's not your usual spinal reflex of somebody hits your knee and your leg pops out, or so that you get a lordosis, the back arching reflex, if and only if estrogen levels are elevated. And there's a guy at Rockefeller University named Don Pfaff, who's an amazing scientist who's in mid-80s now, and he spent the last 60 years studying what is it that make, ovulating rats and guinea pigs and hamsters and such elicit a lordosis reflex. What's been neuroendocrinology of that? He has had generations of graduate students who have spent years like pushing on the flanks of female hamsters and seeing what happens, x-rays of them, real lifetime x-rays of the back arching, and what's the relationship between estrogen levels and how much the back arches and stuff, and getting this circuit completely understood. Another realm of an innate releasing mechanism in humans, which is, in humans in this case, which is we look at certain types of faces and the amygdala activates, and it lowers our threshold for feeling fear or anxiety. What sort of faces cause this to happen? We will get to this in the aggression lectures, but just to give away the punchline, this is the world of if the person counts as a them, your amygdala is more likely to activate when you look at them. And people right now know the exact circuitry by which seeing the face of an us versus the face of the them, which pathways in the brain go into either activating or not activating the amygdala. So, neuroethology, although people wouldn't frame it that way, but beginning to take apart the black box. So what's going on in here? You could do it out in the field. And a version of that, this is a guy at UC Davis, and I kid you not, his name actually is John Wingfield, and he studies birds out in the field, an ethologist. He was out of that bird song school, and he does the stuff on like birds that migrate from Baja to the Arctic each year, and how do they know it, and how do they know to ovulate up there and give birth down here, and he's worked out the entire circuitry of that, and trying to understand this physiological and behavioral plasticity. If there's lots of food just around the time that you, this female bird, send your ducklings off into the big bad world, whatever, and if there's enough food around, it elicits you to start mating gestures and mating fixed action patterns and to ovulate a second time and do a gamble. You can squeeze a second brood out of this optimal season. So ethology, neuroethology out in the field. Some of my work that I did over decades with baboons in East Africa was, I guess, what counts as neuroethology. And this was studying the brain chemistry in these animals of something called endogenous benzodiazepines. And we'll eventually learn all about that. Benzodiazepines, pharmacological versions of them, are Valium and Librium, tranquilizers. Benzodiazepines, including the benzodiazepines that you make in your brain instead of taking some Valium, decrease anxiety. They have anti-anxiety effects, and it's completely known how that works. It's totally interesting. And like you could go out in the field and look at baboons of different social ranks and dart them at a distance with a drug which for 10 minutes will block their benzodiazepine receptors and see the relationship between their rank and what that does to their behavior. And what you see is if you're a low-ranking baboon, your brain makes a lot more of these anti-anxiety things than if you're high-ranking, because you're spending all your time trying to decrease the anxiety that somebody's about to take out their bad mood on you. Neuroethology again, some of the circuitry. For example, showing that in these baboons, some of the hormone changes that change if you were low-ranking are identical to what you see in a human with major depression at the level of the brain, the pituitary, and following the rules of ethology. This is not because you're dissecting these animals and killing them or taking them apart, but just from an ethological outsider, how much information can you get about this animal's body and how it fits in with its behavior? So, neuroethology. So we've now just gotten a sense of what the behavior looks like, fixed action patterns, adaptive value of it, the releasing stimuli, and then suddenly in creep the behaviorists, these discredited behaviorists, We say, well, what about learning? What do ethologists have to say about learning? And some of the time, what learning is about is just like the classical behaviorist models, reinforcement theory and trial and error and all of that. And what's interesting in terms of ethology, learning happening in places where you wouldn't expect it to occur. Probably like the best example of this was in the realm of if you are a mother, if you were a female monkey and you become a mother, you don't instinctually know how to be a good mother at it. You need to learn. You need to learn at it. Competent mothering is not a fixed action pattern among non-human primates, I guess among human primates as well. It's a set of skills that have to be acquired where you get better at it over time. What does learning how to be a good mother look like in other primate species? This is work done by Sarah Hrdy of UC Davis, who was the person who back in the 1980s discovered competitive infanticide. And her recent decades has been on all the ways in which mothering is not a natural reflex in female primates. You need to learn. What's meant by learning? You see mothers get better at attaching their baby to their nipple. Mothers get better at being able to push their kid onto their back to ride on them. Mothers get better at not dropping their kid out of a tree. Things like, how do you tell that learning is involved? Really, really interesting set of studies, which is you are a young female rhesus monkey and you could be living in one of two types of families. One is like she's got a bunch of brothers or little sisters or whatever, versus you have an older sister, which means she is likely to have a baby at some point while you're still just getting in the ballpark of thinking about things like that. And what you see is if you have an older sister, you're a better mother when you have your first child. Some of it is by observational learning. Some of it is by babysitting, by doing anting behavior, where you'll hold the kid for a while so your sister can go and forage or take a nap or take a bath or some such thing that she hasn't been able to do. You do anting, you get experience that way. You're an ant acquiring maternal skills. So let's get in some kin selection issues right here. So you've got your kid sister, you're a female rhesus monkey with your new baby, and you've got your kid sister, and you've got to make a evolutionary choice. Do you want your kid sister to learn how to mother, like to the point where she screws up and drops the kid and kills your kid and all of that? No. Putting out your life for two sisters or eight cousins isn't going to work this way. You don't want her learning so much at a major cost to your reproductive future. On the other hand, if she becomes a competent mother by babysitting your kid, there's a greater likelihood that her first child is going to survive because she's already competent. And we have a kin selection cost benefit optimization thing there. But what you see here is being a competent primate mother is not instinctual. Another version of this, meerkats, I don't know, you guys are probably too young for Meerkat Manor, which was this TV natural wildlife thing some years ago, and this whole soap drama of these meerkats and stuff. And one of the things you learn, these meerkats out in the Kalahari Desert, what they like to do is eat scorpions, and they're incredibly good at killing a scorpion without getting stung by it. And what you see is kids do not instinctually know how to catch a scorpion and not get killed by it. They have to learn. Mom needs to teach them. And what you see is this process. Mom will go and kill a scorpion, and instead of eating it, she'll bring it over to the kid, who sniffs around and learns what it looks like and where you bite it and stuff like that. And the kid gets experience with a totally safe scorpion. And the kid gets good at that. And what does mom do to the next level of lessons? She catches a scorpion, doesn't kill it, catches it, and bites off its stinger. So it's not dangerous. And then she lets it loose around her kid, who could now practice hunting and things like that without getting. And finally, your kid has it together enough that they graduate to actually try to get real scorpions. And this is a learning process. Vervet monkeys learning this. Vervet monkeys, when they are little, when two kids are hanging out with each other, they both vocalize at the same time, and they're both like blathering to themselves and to each other, and they're not paying any attention. And what you see is, as they get older, their vocalizations begin to alternate. They begin to take turns. They learn some vervet monkey equivalent of having a conversation. They learn the appropriate ways by which you go about vocalizing with another member of your species. Okay, so the punchline in all of these is, yeah, these are classic behaviorist routes to learning, but who would ever guess that females need to learn how to be competent mothers if you're a primate? Ooh, we just all have this belief, this intuitive stereotype that women are just designed to know how to mother. No, primates, it's a skill that needs to be acquired through a lot of behaviorist rules. Who would have guessed that you give your baby meerkat like progressively difficult lessons in scorpion catching? So in some cases, the appearance of just classical learning, sort of paradigms and such, in some cases, it's simply surprising how it's done. And the flashiest one, the one that winds up in like every single nature book for kids when talking about stuff like this, comes from the loathsome Konrad Lorenz, which is he discovered something interesting. What did he have? Ducks, baby ducks. He would have baby ducks and little ones there who were just born. And how does a baby duck learn who mom is? And it turns out it involves a phenomenon that came to be called imprinting. Imprinting, different from imprinted genes from 2 weeks ago. We have that complication with the same term. Imprinting in an ethological sense in the brains of newborn ducklings is a rule that if there's something big and animate moving around you in like your first 2 hours of life, that's mom. Imprint on that. Imprint on her and follow her around throughout your development there. How do you learn who mom? There's one trial learning, imprinting. And what Lorenz was able to show was imprinting, how it could go totally awry, how mechanical it could be. He would imprint baby ducklings on like trash cans rolling on wheels. Most famously, he would imprint baby ducklings on himself, which would give rise to these heartwarming pictures of Nazi Konrad Lorenz in his cute little shorts and alpine suspenders there, walking through the field with his little ducklings following them. And once he'd sort of shown how that was working, of course, he would abandon them heartlessly. But that's another realm of one trial learning, imprinting learning. But then you enter the whole ethological world of types of learning that completely violate classic behaviorist models. And this is this whole phenomenon called prepared learning. So if you're a behaviorist, if you're trying to train somebody to associate some stimulus with something aversive happening, conditioning them to have a conditioned fear response, it could be a sight, it could be a sound, it could be a smell, it could be anything you put up there. It could be a picture of B.F. Skinner, it could be a picture of Konrad Lorenz's knees, whatever it is. You get conditioned. The fear response you condition with a universality that doesn't really care about what the stimulus is. But what you see is it is easier to do fear conditioning for some stimuli than others. We are prepared to learn these associations more readily. Classic example of this. Everybody knows we're innately afraid of spiders and snakes. Humans are not innately afraid of spiders and snakes. It's acquired fear. There's like cultures where kids chase the poisonous spiders down to catch them and eat them and teach you tricks and stuff. And snakes, obviously you get these crazy people who have like an apartment somewhere filled with pythons. And we do not have an automatic, innate, irrepressible phobia about spiders or snakes. What we have, though, is prepared learning. You learn some associations faster than others, and we humans show prepared learning. We learn associations between scary things, scary outcomes, and spiders and snakes faster than we learn them about neutral objects. Another example of this, something known as the sauce bernaise syndrome. You eat something, and while you're eating it, you listen to music, and thanks to an experimental manipulation, once again, by the way, who's giving their kids to be like conditioned to be afraid of spiders and soup ladles and such? But now with the sauce bernaise, what you do is somebody eats something at the same time that they're listening to some sort of music, and then you give them something or revert to swallow so that 6 hours later they are nauseous as hell. They feel, and what happens the next time they hear that music, they listen to the music. The next time they smell the smell of that food, they say, oh my God, that's just like making me feel queasy and stuff. I can't eat that stuff. They have an easier time learning to associate a gustatory stimulus with a stomach ache than an auditory stimulus. This is known as the sauce bernaise syndrome, an interesting history of it. This guy named Martin Seligman at U Pennsylvania, who pioneered this stuff, showing like, okay, we are wired up so that we learn to find food smells to be aversive, to be something to avoid when the outcome, the consequence is a stomach ache more readily than a sight or a sound. Big surprise that we evolved that way. That makes perfect sense. So prepared learning like that, one trial learning. And another version of prepared learning in humans is one that we're going to come back to in agonizing, depressing detail in the aggression lectures down the line. You are conditioning somebody to associate a neutral stimulus with something painful. You put up the face of someone, you put up a face, I should explain this. You put up the face of someone and you give somebody a shock. And you show them the face again and you give them a shock, and eventually you can show that you just show them the face and you have a conditioned fear response. The person starts breathing faster, their heart rate goes up, there's a whole physiology to that. And what you see is humans have prepared learning. It is easier to condition a fear response in us if it is the face of someone who counts as a them, so that by the time kids are about 10 months old, they react differently to faces of us's than faces of them. You are more likely to get a fear response with the latter. Ooh, how do they learn who's an us and them? Who your parents hang out with, what kind of faces, what kind of voices, what kind of accents, what kind of whatevers are familiar, that are around, and that's your rules for who to count as an us. And by 10 months of age, kids already have a whole bunch of fear responses in place if it's instead the face of a them. And what's the neuroethology of that like, so that 30 years later, that's going to influence your voting preferences. That's going to influence who you're afraid of, who you cross the street to avoid, who you would sacrifice yourself for, even if they're not two cousins or 8 siblings or whatever. How does that stuff turn into in-group, out-group biases and stuff? A lot of that is ethological principles, because we have evolved to find some types of stimuli to be scarier than others. Okay, we now push to the newest frontier of ethology, which would be called cognitive ethology, which is, so how do animals think? How do they make decisions? What's the cognitive world of another species like? And the first thing that people had to get over with that is, you mean animals think, they reason, they have cognition? We will see that whole new branch of ethology that popped up only in recent decades. So, finishing up with my panda ears, we will resume on Monday.